Hey everybody. This is an introduction to State Capitalism and World Revolution, the book written by C.L.R. James, Raya Dunayevskaya, and Grace Lee Boggs. What was I going to say? The introduction is by Paul Buhle. Paul Buhle wrote the official biography of C.L.R. James, Artist is Revolutionary. But the reason I'm reading this is to see if there's anything, trying to look at it as like a substantial secondary source on like James's commentary on the USSR and his state capitalist conception of it. I don't know what I'll actually find, but let's see. This is from 1986. Two generations ago, C.L.R. James and a small circle of collaborators set forth a revolutionary critique of industrial civilization. Their vision possessed a striking originality. Insular was the political context of their theoretical breakthroughs, however, and so thoroughly did their optimistic expectations for working-class activity defy trends away from class and social issues to the so-called, quote, end of ideology, end quote, that the documents of the signal effort never reached public view. Happily, times have changed. James has become a late-life celebrity, near legend, eminence grise of Pan-Africanism, admired cultural critic. The corpus of his theoretical work is available in 3 volumes of selected essays, a philosophical work, Notes on Dialectics, and his major work of literary criticism, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways. Readers have discovered much even after all these years to challenge Marxist or any other orthodoxy. They will never find a more succinct version of James's general conclusions than State Capitalism and World Revolution. And this is a footnote here. U.S. editions cited where available. The Future and the Present, Selected Essays, Volume 1. Spheres of Existence, Selected Writings, Volume 2. At the Rendezvous of Victory, Selected Essays, Volume 3. Notes on Dialectics, and Beyond a Boundary. These are all works of C.L.R. James. Anyway, end footnote. In this slim volume, James and his comrades successfully predict the future course of Marxism. Contrary to reigning old left dogmas, they argue that the workers on both sides of the Iron Curtain and under any variety of state or private ownership face the same essential contradictions. The drive for ever-expanding productivity disguises a mad rationalism, unable any longer to reconcile its aims of total control with the technological means at hand. The sorcerer's apprentice recognizes no democratic human solution. Socialists, communists, and Trotskyists alike, themselves heir to the ideology of economic fatalism and political elites, tragically share the same blind spot. The old forms of working-class expression, such as left or labor parties, unions, and state ownership of production, have become part of the logic of continued capitalist development. New forms of mass self-expression must arise against these bureaucratized institutions and against the assumptions they harbor. Radicals who fail to heed these warnings to aid the newer developments betray their own best instincts and the best traditions of Marxism. The insight expressed here takes us from the world of Trotsky, Stalin, and Norman Thomas to the world of New Left, Black Power, and Polish Solidarity. But the form of argumentation in State Capitalism and World Revolution threatens to obscure the actual breakthrough from the casual reader. As James would recall in his autobiographical notes, quote, the thing that mattered chiefly was the correct political line that had enabled Lenin to defeat all his rivals and lead the Russian Revolution to success, end quote. If this project had been, in retrospect, quote, a complete illusion, end quote, then, quote, we believed in it completely and were able to examine it and find the weaknesses that were in it, end quote. Footnote. From unpublished notes for autobiography in author's possession, end footnote. From the last lines of the original introduction, the text bristles with manifestations of the imminent critique, attacks on Trotskyist groups and on representatives unknown outside the small movement. And on perspectives unknown outside the small movement. State capitalism and world revolution must be seen as an exercise in self-clarity, or it would not be seen at all. Even the omissions we would now regard as major take on a distinct meaning in this light. The book seems oblivious to ethnicity and religion, always central to working class life, and even to race, an area where James had previously made fundamental contributions, atomic armament in the struggle against atomic armament, the, quote, woman question, end quote, that had reemerged sharply during the Second World War and would shortly become a central theoretical issue for James's group. These issues, too, were put aside. Culture, the keynote of social movements since the early 1960s, can hardly be found at all. An almost syndicalist intensity on the shop floor struggle and its implication crowds out these other issues. Only the workers, their essential similarity and potential worldwide links, come fully into view. And that is surely the point. James had to narrow the focus so that the outlines would become clear. The careful reader will also find a, quote, hidden text, end quote, straining to escape the straitjacket of formal political discourse. James and his circle wished to restore the revolutionary continuity of Hegel, the young Marx, and the aging Lenin, not only for the sake of political strategy, but to recover a conception practically lost since the First International. The founding father of Marxism promised his vision of socialism upon the abolition of the growing dichotomy between mental and manual labor, a dichotomy which mutilated the worker's natural creativity and which rendered the intellectual an isolate. Lenin, the political chief of an unwanted bureaucratic state apparatus, staged his final struggle to create the basis for direct economic democracy. So very, very serious whitewashing of Lenin. On anything less than a world scale, the contradictions could not and cannot be finally overcome. The age of dictators in the political Kremlins, military pentagons, and state planning bureaus or corporate headquarters had, by the 1940s, seemingly vanquished humanity's best hopes and relegated, quote, socialism, end quote, to varieties of state regulation. State capitalism and world revolution insists, rather, that the very heightening of internal antagonisms and catastrophic possibilities means the real end of class society may be closer than radicals themselves realize. Ordinary people have been prepared by their own uniquely modern experiences, good and bad. Now only the opportunity for the full use of their collective genius is lacking. Couched in the language of political warfare, state capitalism and world revolution is a gospel of hope. However unrealized that hope 35 years later, it remains the alternative to the spread of gulags and bloodbaths, and to the fast approaching doomsday. C.L.R. James's first, quote, American years, end quote, 1938 to 1953, of which this book offers the foremost political evidence, can be seen best as a slice of life surrounded by what had gone before and what has followed. At 31 in 1932, James left his native Trinidad to explore the sources of his British colonial legacy. In the following 6 years, he managed to become cricket correspondent for the Manchester Guardian, a prominent Trotskyist writer and orator, a pioneer of African emancipation, and an author of several important books, including the classic history, Black Jacobins, and a Trotskyist, quote, Bible, end quote, of Comintern history, World Revolution, 1917 to 36. James then exited for America, where he made his home for 15 years until his deportation in 1953, nominally for a passport violation, but in reality because of his political status. Since then, James has lived for periods in England, the Caribbean, and after 1970, again in the United States. James has served into old age as vigorous radical social theorist, dynamic lecturer, political influence, and at times political leader on several continents. Footnote. Biographical data from various essays in C.L.R. James, His Life and Work, edited by Paul Buhle, originally published in Urgent Tasks and Race Today. End footnote. Only in the first American years, however, did James lead a political group for a sustained period, and set out with others to solve collectively the puzzle of Marxism's legacy for the late 20th century. Illuminating this heretofore little-known period of his life offers a way to understand otherwise curious aspects of state capitalism and world revolution. The story begins in Coyoacan, Mexico, with James's spirited dialogue with Leon Trotsky. Supported by small if energetic groups, outmaneuvered by the Popular Front coalition, which threw vast liberal and social democratic influences behind Moscow's anti-fascist policies, Trotsky gamely outlined his plans for a revolutionary breakthrough. James presented a new element in the question. Virtually Trotskyism's only internationally known third world figure, James had proved himself in Britain, but his political ally more than disciple. Indeed, James's intellectual and political methods, his wide range of associates in non-political and even communist milieu, had already disturbed British Trotskyist orthodoxy. James would in America shortly join a crusade against Trotsky's leadership and later turn against Trotskyism altogether. The discussion pitted the two remarkable figures as equals, perhaps to Trotsky's surprise. The obvious bone of contention lay in the, quote, Negro question, end quote, and its larger significance. Trotsky argued in good Bolshevik fashion that blacks would be brought into the Trotskyist party or into Trotskyist-led mass movements, taught proper politics, and directed the way the Bolsheviks had directed national minorities within and alongside Russian borders. James disputed the contention. Blacks, he insisted, did not need to be led by the labor movement or anyone else. Blacks could be significantly aided by revolutionary thinkers and activists. But rather than socialist politics freeing blacks would themselves precipitate the radical movement in the United States, creating a mass force led by blacks struggling for their democratic rights. Footnote. The text of the conversation, but only as regards the first point, is contained in Leon Trotsky on Black Nationalism and Self-Determination, Pathfinder Press, 1967, end footnote. Too much might be made of this particular argument. The Great Exile gave ground. While most Trotskyists remained fixed in their task of organizing disciplined parties to the exclusion of almost everything else. Trotsky and James shared, after all, a concrete experience in the international arena where political mobilization assumed a variety of different forms. Footnote. On this and several other points, as regards Trotskyism, I wish to thank Kent Worcester for his series James Scholarship and his comradely criticisms. End footnote. Like the lesser Trotskyists, the two identified the Russian Revolution. End footnote. Like the lesser Trotskyists, Trotsky and James identified the Russian Revolution as the key event of the century, and the formation of strong national organizations as chief means to resurrect true internationalism. But James venerated a different Lenin, perhaps, than Trotsky or the Trotskyists. His, Lenin, was a prophet of colonial revolution by people of color, people whose circumstances practically excluded the kind of straightforward proletarian party typical of Europe and much desired in the United States. Implicit in the distinction was also James's confidence in the rural workers on whose backs capitalism accrued its first, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote. Their appearance on the stage of history, in their own name, marked not only an economic, social, but also a cultural turning point in revolutionary possibilities. Quote, Trotsky declared that the proletariat does not grow under world capitalism and declines in culture. This is absolutely false, end quote. James was right in 1950. what he had observed on the cricket fields and calypso tents. He quickly appreciated Afro-American culture, from church rituals to the Cotton Club. The confluence of formerly rural cultures into the industrial urban proletariat supplied a key to the enigma. Although James would not yet phrase it this way, which found Euro-American Marxism at a loss since the First World War and the isolation of the Russian experiment. Footnote. On this point, see especially Sylvia Winter's Inquest of Matthew Bondsman, some cultural notes on the Jamesian journey, in Urgent Task 12, and C.L.R. James, His Life and Work. End footnote. James wholeheartedly agreed with Trotsky's goal of forging a, quote, American Bolshevism, end quote. What sought a Bolshevism the Trotskyists never anticipated. At Coyoacán, James asked Trotsky why European Trotskyist groups could actually stagnate at a time of rising European labor struggles. James viewed Trotsky's defense of the vanguard party's, quote, ultimate, end quote, triumph with considerable skepticism. This disagreement went to the heart of things. The disproportion of Trotskyist vanguard claims and actual influence defied credulity. In other parts of the world where communists assumed control of the anti-fascist partisan military forces, their organizations would indeed come to power, purging their radical democratic critics in the process. But in the unconquered nations, and most clearly the United States, the Marxist political parties in their classic form, and with their political rather than military aims, had by the late 1930s reached the apex of their influence, a rarefied altitude from which descent would be both swift and permanent. James's observation of American life reinforced this understanding. The self-possession of the ordinary American struck him as almost unbelievable. Quote, every American citizen, ignorant of so many things that his European counterpart knows, is conscious of himself as a distinct personality, in his own opinion and the opinion of his fellows, as entitled to special consideration of his ideas, his feelings, his likes and dislikes, as the most aristocratic heroine of a European novel, end quote. James would say in Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways. But this advance was not painless. Quite to the contrary, for, quote, at the same time, he is consumed by the need of intimate communion with his fellows, end quote. Footnote. Preface to Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways. Liberation from the weight of the past which holds back Europeans impels Americans to become free, to grapple urgently for social relations which can turn the universal sense of desperation into an integrated modern self, that could be achieved only by social transformations of a scale and quality considered a distant successor to proletarian revolution by 19th century Marxists. Such a view of socialism, sophisticated even now, was in the 1930s and 40s where indeed similar notions advanced by the anarcho-mystic Gustav Landauer or Lenin's, quote, ultra-left, end quote, opponent, Dutch poet Herman Gorter, had been outside the main currents of the left. Some cultural movements, surrealism in particular, sought to return questions of consciousness and individual transformation to the center of the revolutionary stage. But these were isolated by the success of communist machinations and by the shroud of pessimism held above the 1930s movement after the Nazi seizure of power. E.g., see André Breton's What is Surrealism, edited by Franklin Rosemont. Oh, that's what's up. Franklin Rosemont's I don't really know much about him, but he seems like a pretty cool person. And was it Penelope Rosemont, his partner? They seem pretty badass in my opinion in terms of like their interests. Andre Breton, I think, was initially a communist, joined the Trotskyist movement, um, and then became affiliated with the Anarchist Federation in Spain in the not in Spain, in France in the 1950s. Um, I really would like to know more about anarchism in France in the 1950s and since then, because it kind of seems like um, that is probably the location within the world in which anarchist communism and other left-wing forms of anarchism have had their strongest presence. But I feel like there's something in here that I disagreed with. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Who cares what I think? In the United States, cultural questions remain the province of intellectuals, save in the restricted foreign language circles of autodidact workers. Actual factory-based movements largely continued an old-fashioned belief in economism, anticipating that the victory of, quote, rational, end quote, socialism over, quote, irrational, end quote, capitalism would bring automatic solutions to all remaining social problems. James readily appreciated his exceptional point of observation within American society and sought to make the most of his opportunity for a fresh view of the familiar leftist blinders. While taking part in the Trotskyist movement as lecturer and organizer of Missouri sharecroppers and factional wrangler, he also led a separate and almost, quote, unpolitical, end quote, existence. He lived near Harlem and held discussions with intellectuals ranging from Richard Wright to Theodore Adorno. I didn't know he talked to Adorno. That's new. Richard Wright is a poet, or a novelist. He's a literary figure, or like native son, and I think is part of like the Harlem Renaissance. I read his like introduction on Wikipedia yesterday. I didn't. That's new information to me. I'm not a very well-studied literary person. James gulped down American literature, not accepting the, quote, reaction, accepting not as in ACC, but EXCF, EXCEPTING, so not excluding the, quote, reactionary, end quote, Poe and Faulkner. And James struck many of his political associates not only as a brilliant and encyclopedic Marxist thinker, but also an extreme eccentric. Future luminaries from the same circle, such as Irving Howe or Hal Draper, seemed genuinely baffled by his charismatic appeal and by his heterodox views. Others regarded him as a mystic, crypto-anarchist, or black nationalist. Footnote: communications from Irving Howe and Hal Draper to the author. Discussions with Socialist Workers' Party and Workers' Party veterans. Some in files of the Oral History of the American Left collection at Tamiment Library, New York University. End footnote. Probably only a small circle could accept perspectives so radically out of kilter with existing doctrines. As James tells the story, the break of a Trotskyist faction with Trotsky himself in 1940 over their unwillingness to support Russia in the coming war unleashed a profound sense of discontinuity in the Marxist tradition. James Burnham, perhaps the most prominent intellectual besides C.L.R. James in the group, unleashed a blistering polemic against dialectical materialism as outdated nonsense disregarded by all serious scientific thought. The faction's main leader, Max Shachtman, propounded a theory of Russian social dynamics which seemed to place the new bureaucratic system outside the Marxist analysis of class contradiction. The roof seemed to be caving in from several directions at once. Nor was this a misperception. Burnham was, by the late 1940s, the foremost intellectual advocate for military confrontation with the Soviet Union, and Shachtman the policy architect of later AFL-CIO's support for the Vietnam War. James himself wondered if he should return to Britain. I don't believe that was Shachtman's position in the late 1940s. I believe that Shachtman's rightward turn was a later phenomenon. The singular Raya Dunayevskaya, a Russian-born intellectual and secretary to Trotsky, persuaded James to stay in order to begin the collective effort required to renew the basis of Marxist thought. Fluent in Russian, she had already determined that everything Lenin wrote about Marxism, especially his analysis of capitalist production and his commentaries on Marx's relevant interpretations, should be translated and circulated for discussion. Grace Lee, daughter of a prominent Asian American restaurateur and herself a philosophy PhD, made the pair a trio, and her work on German language materials. Strange as it now seems, the first English translation from Marx's 1844 economic philosophic manuscripts were mimeographed by James's group for discussions with Detroit auto workers. James supplied the worldview and literary skills for the collective tasks. Around the three grew a following which numbered at its peak around 70, including union militants, a few black activists, and a direct descendant of Tom Paine. Footnote: published material on the Johnson Forest tendency remains scarce. See James and Grace Lee Boggs, quote, A Critical Reminiscence in Urgent Tasks 12, also reminiscences of Grace Lee and James Boggs, Nettie Kravitz, Martin Glaberman, Marjorie O'Brien, Leah Dillon Grant, Stan Ware, Steve Zellick, and Raya Dunayevskaya in the Oral History of the American Left collection, NYU. For microfilm documents from the Johnson Forest Tendency, see Raya Dunayevskaya Papers, Wayne State University. Only in recent years have historians taken seriously the levels of contemporary discontent, which gave James's group spheres of actual influence and reasons to hope for dramatic social change. Wartime strikers rebelled at once against union leadership, government, and employers. In the several years immediately following Allied victory, industrialists sought to recoup concessions made to workers since the 1930s, while newer members of the industrial workforce removed Southerners, especially blacks and women retaining their jobs, along with the returned GIs, demanded a piece of the better world they had been promised for past sacrifices. City general strikes and industry-wide actions crossed jurisdictional lines and inspired a blue-collar camaraderie unknown since the sit-down days, but this time frequently critical of unions themselves. Small business and no few labor leaders responded with panic. The Republican Congress and the Truman administration seized the opportunity afforded by the Cold War to blame the unrest, altogether undeservedly, on the communists and to enact new measures, most notably the Taft-Hartley Act, limiting labor activism. Militant labor suffered a defeat whose sorry consequences remain to this day. But even the pulsating frustration, disappointment, and unrealized aspirations led a creative outburst of popular music, sport, and film. The nation seemed to pause between the utopian anti-Nazi zeal slipping away and the social stasis, urban flight, and consumer cravings of the 1950s. Footnote: the best account of this era is George Lipsett's Class and Culture in Cold War America, quote, A Rainbow at Midnight, end quote. Such counter-institutional militancy in the absence of a socialist or communist party on a European scale gave James's political innovations a special urgency. Time was running out. The paucity of actual Trotskyists, however, made, in retrospect, raise questions about James's contemporary optimism. I once frankly asked James how he thought a movement of several hundred could expect to change a country of 100 million. Behind the famous Marxist confidence in historical logic, behind the infamous Trotskyist grouplet striving for the correct political position, might be found an intellectual's resolve. His many intellectual friends at the time shared James's political conclusions, domestic and international, but felt helpless, isolated, and impotent. The atomic annihilation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the full reports of the Holocaust, deepened the sense of paralysis. The cultivated Jewish sensitivity which balanced proletarian revolutionary commitment with love for Toscanini and fascination with psychoanalysis had been the Shachtman group's existential raison d'etre. Now, as the promised political breakthrough for the group failed to appear, and so much of the world situation appeared bleak, the collective will gave way. Years before the group shriveled in size and its foremost leaders turned sharply to the right, pessimism suffused the cadres. Cadres. I always said cadre, but I think I've been pronouncing it wrong for a long time. I gotta use the bathroom. James's circle had an almost unique sense of actual optimism within or outside the Shachtman group. Unlike communists or liberals, the Johnson-Forrest tendency based its hopes not on Allied victory and post-war Russo-American cooperation in a state-regulated world order, but rather in the instinctive rebellion against that order. Unlike the Shachtmanites or their opposing twin, the Socialist Workers' Party led by James P. Cannon, they believed the possibilities of mass mobilization had drastically altered the revolutionaries' own role. The group first proposed to convert the rest of the Trotskyists to its evolving position. James insisted the Workers' Party, quote, recognize its function as a group making propaganda for revolutionary action to the masses, end quote, i.e. leap over the anticipated party-building stage almost entirely. When other leaders pointed to the political and cultural, quote, backwardness, end quote, of American labor as proof of the need for an educational organizational interregnum before the decisive battle with capitalism, James brought forward his own prognostications. Lenin, James argued, had late in life repudiated the instrumental elitism of what is to be done, the dogma that only the revolutionary could educate workers. The great Bolshevik leader saw correctly that the strategic position of Russian workers in the economy and urban society thrust them into a pivotal role regardless of other factors. As a footnote, I would encourage you to listen to a footnote for myself. I would encourage you to listen to the piece by Matthew Quest talking about the historical problems with James's understanding of Lenin and his role in the destruction of working class democracy in the early Soviet Union. Yes, check that out. Back to the text. Lenin, James argued, had late in life repudiated the instrumental elitism of what is to be done, the dogma that only the revolutionary could educate workers. The great Bolshevik leader saw correctly that the strategic position of Russian workers in the economy and urban society thrust them into a pivotal role, regardless of other factors. Moreover, James added, the American proletariat had other special sources of strength. The social democratic reformism dominant in Western Europe, the European Communist Party's restraint on workers, had no strength here. As so frequently in our brutal industrial history, American class forces faced off against each other virtually unmediated. Quote, the American proletariat, end quote, James concluded, quote, is literally revolting against the very conditions of production itself, end quote. Footnote. Balance sheet, Trotskyism in the United States, 1940 to 47, the Workers' Party and the Johnson-Forrest tendency. This document traces the internal evolution of the group better than any other. The balance sheet completed, a lesser document published 3 years later, concludes the odyssey through American Trotskyism. End footnote. Among a series of documents outlining the Johnson-Forrest tendency perspectives, the Invading Socialist Society, published in 1947, just as the group prepared entry into the Socialist Workers' Party, provides the decisive break with the other positions and foreshadows state capitalism and world revolution. Here, James argued for the first time that communist parties were not essentially, quote, tools of the Kremlin, end quote, as Trotskyist orthodoxists claim, but rather, quote, an organic product of the mode of capitalism at this stage, end quote. Seen in that way, a new objective layer of intelligentsia and union leadership, disillusioned with private capitalism but unable to see workers' capacity for self-rule, could be understood as a result of historical dialectics. Stalinism ceased to be viewed as a grotesque and ultimately inexplicable distortion of the revolutionary process. To the contrary, Stalinism had to be, quote, a necessary and inevitable form of development of the labor movement, end quote. James refused to be drawn into the blanket anti-communism which singled out Russia as the main enemy to progress and its American supporters as the main opponents that Trotskyists had to overcome. James perceived the similarity in communist and Trotskyist supporters of various bureaucratic tendencies, and he drew a strategic conclusion, quote, it is the task of the Fourth International to drive a clean line between bourgeois nationalization and proletarian nationalization, as the revolutionary Third International drove between bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy, end quote. James intended to detach the goal from the Trotskyist means. Footnote. C.L.R. James, Freddie Forrest, and Raya Stone, i.e. Freddie Forrest being Raya Dunayevskaya, and Raya Stone being Grace Lee, The Invading Socialist Society. This is reprinted in a book, A New Notion, 2 works by C.L.R. James. Where am I? State capitalism and world revolution may itself be regarded as a step toward the philosophical conclusions spelled out in Facing Reality, written with Grace Lee and published in 1958 when James had already gone into exile. There James took positive cognizance of the American Black Movement, the nationalist revolutions in Asia and Africa, and above all the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. These had begun to carry out, albeit in different ways, the hopes expressed in his Trotskyist years. He also drew moral conclusions that the strictures of Trotskyism had not allowed. James judged the arms race, the stifling official culture, and the ethical bankruptcy of East and West alike as decisive proof that, quote, official society is not in decline, as civilization, as culture, as reason, as morals, it is already dead, end quote. Footnote. Facing Reality by C.L.R. James and Pierre Chelu, i.e. Paul Cardin, pseudonym of Cornelius Castoriadis of the Socialissime Barbarie group in France. Chelu reportedly did not really collaborate on this book, but added his authorship for strategic reasons. See Paul Berman's penetrating comments on this, quote, underground classic, end quote, in, quote, Facing Reality, end quote, in Urgent Task 12 and C.L.R. James' Life and Work. End footnote. The reader can judge in the following text how far James had already gone along the road to this larger view in 1950. State Capitalism and World Revolution is also the last of James' texts to be set in the classic Marxist-Leninist strategic framework. Facing Reality seemed to many a de facto anarchism, the author's disclaimers notwithstanding. Sheared away from the last of the vanguard moorings, the revolutionary group had lost its cadre-building mission between the waves of radical upsurge. Its political role became uncertain. Here, in a concrete political sense, James's group foreshadowed the successes and limitations of the New Left. It could publish a newspaper remarkably lively and optimistic for its day, the early 1950s, seize upon the implications of phenomenon, wildcat strikes are the first stirrings of black power in the unions, better than the doctrine-ridden left, and encourage young people with its wide-ranging belief in human creativity. It cannot so easily maintain or even justify its own separate existence. James himself was wont to say that the group, through its various emanations, from its official abandonment of Trotskyism in 1950 to its formal dissolution in 1970. What group is being discussed here? The Johnson-Forrest tendency? I'm confused. Anyway, back to the text. It could not so easily maintain or even justify its own separate existence. James himself was wont to say that the group, through its various emanations, from its official abandonment of Trotskyism in 1950 to its formal dissolution in 1970, knew what it was moving away from, but not so clearly what it was going towards. James had completed a philosophical journey, had seen more clearly than any other political thinker of the older generation the fresh phase of organization and attitude up ahead, but at a cost. Footnote. Accounts of the later James Group's activities are still more scarce. See the reminiscence of a sympathetic outsider, Young Detroit Radicals, 1955 to 1965, by Dan Georgakis in Urgent Task 12, and C.L.R. James, His Life and Work. End footnote. State capitalism and world revolution told the old left what it did not want to hear and spoke to the rising new left in a voice that it could not clearly understand. Now, in the 1980s, circumstances have once again shifted, and this time favorably for the forgotten text. More massively, more completely than the 1956 Hungarian Revolution or the 1968 French Revolt, Polish solidarity has truly vindicated James. Currently, the most drastic reduction of workers' living standards since the late 19th century has brought class issues, if not their solution, home to Europeans and Americans. We live in a world where the revolutionary Chileism, bleeding Latin America, and the collapse of labor officialdom at the imperial centers have become inextricably intertwined. The distance between the, quote, utopian, end quote, wish for total change, and the action required by survival, now reduced to a thin edge of stubborn reality. Footnote. CCC interviews James on Poland. Cultural Correspondence. Volume 2, Winter 1983. End footnote. James has had a way of seeing the faces of the crowd behind the glamour and horror of economic political spectacle. No wonder social historians as a group have been the quickest to appreciate the significance of James's contribution. The meta-theory of state capitalism and world revolution has been the most difficult aspect of James's legacy to apprehend and assimilate, perhaps because the human basis of all social forces remains most hidden. All the same, the reader will find that the text's inner meaning peeps out above the nearly 40 years' distance from its original publication, and above all the difficulties of context and language. The proof lies in Chapter 11. State Capitalism and World Revolution ends, save for 2 pages, with a universal perception. Treaties have been written by quantum physicists, testaments delivered by Native American seers, warnings proclaimed by poets and natural scientists against the calamity that the mechanist perception of the universe has caused in our environment and in our way of understanding life. We can see far better now than in 1950 how the Western conception of conquering nature is related to an attitude about the use of human beings as mere functions of production and consumption. Every day we count the toll in mounting cancer cases and the devastation of some natural setting or species of flora or fauna, eons in creation. We seem to have reserved a prime spot for ourselves in the list of future extinctions. All of James cried out against this worldview when it still held Marxism firmly in its grip. Behind this dialectical critique, not denial of Marxism's and Bolshevism's limitations, but transcendence, which retains the best tradition, thrives a personal insight, both unique and universally human. characteristic not only of James, but of his whole political circle. Let James tell a story about the origins of that insight from the pages of his unpublished autobiography. Quote, I remember my first break with the philosophy of rationalism. It was Bergson, 1934. Bergson's work had come at the turn of the century and was startling to me on two accounts. One, Bergson attacked the abstractions of understanding, capital U understanding, the abstractions of understanding's mechanical categorization, etc., and opposed to this, capital I, intuition. 2. Humor, Bergson said, was the fulfillment of the desire to see the snob and aristocrat humbled, so that the well-dressed man slipping on a banana peel was his classic example of humor. It is still individualistic, as it would be in this philosopher, but I remember it broke me with morbid and melancholy philosophy speculation. End quote. James. The end.